Alrighty guys, let's begin episode 6. The first episode for the beginner level threads. Alright, so I think I'm going to split this into like 3 episodes. This episode is just going to cover the beginning parts of this thread right here. How to make your own cheat codes. Just a portion of it before it links you to the assembly tutorial thread. The assembly tutorial thread I think I'll put in episode 7. And then the second part of how to make your own cheat codes after reading the assembly tutorial will be episode 8. Okay, so let's begin. This will be the start of how to make your own cheat codes from scratch. It is very crucial that you have already followed episodes 1 through 5, not only following the videos but reading the threads as well, and reading every word of every thread and not continuing until you have 100% mastered whatever particular video or thread you are on. It's very crucial to learn the newbie beginner stuff before we progress along our way or along the journey. Alright, so this is episode 6, going from complete noob to veteran ASM Coder. Let's begin. How to make your own cheat codes. Alright. Chapter 1, requirements. Obviously, if you've been doing the journey since episode 1, you already have your computer, you already have your MKW ISOs, you already know how to use basic features of Dolphin, you already got your Dolphin memory engine installed and running, and you already know how to apply cheat codes in the game. Now, one thing that is recommended, but it's not required, is that you have a Wii or a Wii U, preferably an original Wii console. The reason is that when you start making your own codes, you can run into a situation where the code will work on Dolphin, but it won't work on the Wii. Or the code will work on the Wii, but it won't work on Dolphin. Or you might just have some various differences, like a code may have some features that will work on Dolphin, but said features might not work on the Wii console, but the code still technically works. So that's why it's recommended that you have a Wii console so you can test both console emulator. Once you make your codes, if you post them somewhere, you can say, hey guys, yada yada yada, this code will work on Dolphin, however it won't work on the Wii, and vice versa if it applies. Okay, so chapter 1 requirements, covered that little part right there, but going a little further down in chapter 1, other requirements. Have played with MKW cheat codes before, pretty obvious. No basic cheat code documentation. We covered this in episode 2, a 40-minute episode that is very critical, very crucial. And then talked about creating activators and deactivators for codes, pretty necessary. And we also talked about another episode filling in XYZ values, importing codes, because when you start making codes, yeah, your very simple ones might not need XYZ values. They might not need activators and deactivators, or you might not even care about porting them. But once you get to being a real intermediate level or expert level ASM coder, you will eventually need these little things. And it's better to learn them now while you're a noob and do the noob stuff instead of having to learn it later. Okay, so there's a note here. You got to be willing to read, as before. Okay, and this chapter 2 just covers installing Dolphin, installing the RAM viewer. Then it has a little note which was covered in covered in episode 1 when I showed you the tutorial on how to apply cheat codes in Dolphin about the external frame buffer. Make sure that is unchecked for the store XFB, the textures copy, or whatnot. And now we go to chapter 3. Overview of Dolphin. Okay, so when you're running Dolphin to make cheat codes, you actually you don't run it in standard mode. You run it in what's called debugger mode, so it allows you to use these extra features, and Dolphin will run a teeny bit differently than in normal mode. Depending on what dev version you're using, you might have to run debug mode, launch it manually every time, or it will save itself to where if you configure it to run it debug once, it'll run it every time afterwards. Just all depends what dev version you're doing. The key is that we will always be using Dolphin in debugger mode. I can't stress that enough. Okay, so there are some panels and some features that come with the debug mode. The 3 we'll be using in Dolphin is breakpoints. Sorry about that, my cell phone just went off. Will be breakpoints, code, which will be called code view in this guide, and registers. There's another tab and panel called memory, but obviously Aldolaro's Dolphin memory engine, which I will be calling the live RAM viewer, is much better, as Dolphin's memory tab or panel does not update live. You got to refresh it. Terrible UI. You can't run complex searches on it. It's just not good at all. Okay, so the launch, there's tips on how to launch the debug mode in Windows, and also tip to how to run it in Dolphin. But with my dev version, I have an option to where it will boot automatically, so I don't need to run the little flag when I launch it on Linux. But let's continue with the panels. Now, in the thread, I list some screenshots of breakpoints, but obviously I don't need those screenshots. I got Dolphin already running up right now. So when you go to Dolphin, you want to go to View right here at the top, and you see what we talked about earlier. We have codes, registers, then we have breakpoints. So you want to check mark the code, registers, and breakpoint. And when you do, they're going to be in a window like this. So this, I'm just using the crappy memory tab, for example, but you can drag it out and leave it as a window like this. I recommend having windows so you can view multiple things simultaneously. We'll just drag this back there, and it'll click back in. I think I F'd something up. We'll screw it. I can't get it back in right, but you get the idea. You can take something that's like embedded in the menu, click on it, drag it out, and you have it as like a free-flowing panel, like here. So let's go over breakpoints. This is the breakpoint right here. You'll be using this a lot, obviously. But let's run a game really quick so I can show you some more features about breakpoints before we continue. Let's go pause the emulation right here. So now breakpoints, you can delete a specific, this option right here. Well, let's just start from the beginning. This will create a new breakpoint. This will delete a specific selected breakpoint. This will nuke all the breakpoints. You can load some breakpoints that you saved from earlier. I don't really use the load or save option because it's kind of gimmicky. It doesn't work 100%. There's always bugs with it. The delete and clear, you may use it in the future, but we'll just go over new. So you have two types of breakpoints, okay? Now, if you've been following since episode 1, excuse me, I need some water. We talked about two different types of memory, static and dynamic memory, which you learned about in episode 2. For most of the codes that you create yourself from scratch, you'll be using a memory breakpoint, which I like to call dynamic breakpoint. It's for dynamic memory. The instruction breakpoint is for static memory. It's for a code that you already made that you want to revisit or continue working on, or you are working on someone else's already finished code. You would use instruction breakpoint. Okay, if that makes any sense. I'll explain why maybe in a further episode with more details so you can understand it better. But just kind of get the idea that memory breakpoint, this right here, that's the one you'll be using the most because you'll be finding stuff in dynamic memory and you'll be wanting to breakpoint it. Okay, so cancel that. Let's see what else next. I guess we'll just go with the registers next. Doesn't really matter. Okay, this will show you all your registers. Okay. Really important, obviously. There's only a certain amount of registers you really need to be concerned about when you're a beginner, but just know that you'll be using this tab a lot. Essentially, a register is an accessible location of the Wii CPU. So I'll show you a visual representation once we get to the next episode, give you kind of idea of how all this works, how the registers work with memory, how the memory works with registers. But just know you'll be using this register tab a ton. It's very important. Okay, and then code view. Okay, this shows you. Remember I told you how compiled instructions are not readable? Well, what the code view does is it makes those instructions readable. So these are all various instructions, with the green one being highlighted what instruction you are currently on during execution. Very important. You'll be using this a lot, just like registers and breakpoints tab. And that's really about it. Let's go back to the page. Okay, overview of RAM viewer. Let's talk about it. Okay, when you launch it, it won't be hooked. If you launch the RAM viewer after booting the game, it should auto hook. If not, press the hook button. Once you press the hook button, let's just close this out. You see this button right here, open memory viewer. Boom, right here. This will be viewing live memory. If anything changes in memory during gameplay, you can see it happen live in action. As I said, this is like back in episode 1, this is like the icing on the cake. This is super necessary. I mean, technically you could live without it, but I highly recommend you use this. Obviously, memory won't change if you have the emulation paused. Pretty self-explanatory. You got all these wide varying selections you can use for search results, narrowing down search results, types of numbers to use, all sorts of options. It's a great program. This will help you make a lot of good code. So we just minimize that and just kind of show you everything. Okay, ASM Okay. Obviously, to make ASM codes, you have to write instructions, and you write them in a compiler. And then those instructions compile into that hex byte code form we talked about in many episodes. So I provide a link to how to download WeRD GUI. It is kind of like the Noob compiler, plain Jane standard compiler. It works very well on Linux via Wine emulation. I have no issues whatsoever. Easy to run on Windows. Now I will show you. There's some notes in here about how to set the WeRD directory, which you need to read about. I already have it set up or whatever. The one thing about the WeRD compiler, if you can't get it to launch, or in the future, like in the next episode from now or something, you can't get the compiler to actually work or run, it can only stay open. Further down in this thread, right above chapter 9, I give an alternative compiler, which is PyASMH. A much better compiler, but you gotta install quite a bit of shit to make it work. So if you can't get WeRD GUI to work, then run PyASMH. The only reason why I don't include it in the Dolphin tutorial by default is that you gotta install some dependent other programs that are required. And it is a pain to install on Linux, and sometimes it might not work 100% on Linux. So this is why by default we use the WeRD GUI. So let's just visit the WeRD GUI. So this is the address. This is the static memory address you'd be using for whatever code you want to compile. The assembler code is the instructions that you actually write, and then to the right is what is the compiled bytecode that comes when you compile it. This little right arrow here would be the compile instructions into compiled code. You can use the left arrow to take a code that's already made, like an already compiled code, and then see its source or its instructions. So when we say the word source, we're talking about an ASM code's instructions. Some will say, so a coder could say, show me the source, or provide me the source, or they might also say the ASM write, show me the ASM write, or show me the instructions. That's what they mean. They want the actual assembler code. They want the instructions that actually that can make the code compile. So just a little FYI there. Okay, scroll back up. Okay, and I guess I'll wrap up this little episode 6, even though it's really short. But we'll have, episode 6 will wrap up episode 6, because coming up in episode 7, we're going to cover chapter 6 of this tutorial. Learning PowerPC assembly, the entire assembly tutorial. I would say the second most important thread to read of the entire journey, with the simplified cheat code being number 1, first, the most important. So that will wrap it up, guys. So yeah, the only thing I'm going to recap on is I recommend you have all these panels as separate windows that you can drag around, just so when you do start coding, you can view everything simultaneously. And yeah, just get yourself familiar with stuff, play around with it a little bit, especially with the RAM viewer. Just check out some of the extra options and menus and whatnot. Okay, so next episode will be episode 7, the ever so anticipated assembly tutorial. Stay tuned.